monitoring them throughout the show.
We have 3 guests today, and we want to welcome in our first one, Roger Babcock, who is the head of environmental services for the city and county of Honolulu. Thank you so much for being here.
Good day. Nice to see you folks.
So you've been on here before to talk about this topic. Since we last had you on the program, when we had you on before, it was sort of unveiling the Wahiawa site, talking about putting this proposed new landfill in central Oahu. In the months since, there has been a lot of community engagement, some pushback on this plan. What are you hearing from the community?
Well, so nobody really wants to have a landfill in their community or near where they live and work. So there's concern from the community about such a facility. And as you know, there's been quite a bit of action at the legislature this year, and that's kind of wrapping up now. They're down to 2 bills that have to do with the landfill and specifically not allowing that site, to be used because it's agricultural land and over drinking water supply. We know that we can safely do that, but it seems like that's going to be precluded with the legislation that's there now. So that's kind of where we're at, today. Pretty different place than we were a few months ago in December.
And maybe if we can just take a step back for those who maybe are just learning about this issue or don't really have a full context, if you can just provide a brief overview of how this site was chosen and why the mayor and this administration advocated for this and put this this location specifically as a destination for where this would be.
Yeah. So it's kind of been a long process. The city's been involved with trying to find the next landfill site for quite a few years, and there have been various blue ribbon panels and commissions put together to investigate sites, all the potential sites around the island. Most recently, in 2021, the mayor formed a landfill advisory committee to look at trying to site the next landfill. There's a lot of restrictions about where you can put a landfill. Has to be 2 miles from an airport runway, can't be in a tsunami inundation zone, can't be on an active earthquake fault. And then in 2020, the legislature passed Act 73, which put additional restrictions, a half-mile buffer around homes, residences, and hospitals, as well as all conservation lands. So that really changed, made additional limitations of where it could be put. So the Landfill Advisory Committee evaluated 6 sites, all kind of in central Oahu, somewhere between Haleiwa and Kunia, all in the central part of the island. In 2022, in November, we had the Red Hill catastrophe, which brought a lot of attention to potable water and concern about potentially locating a landfill over the aquifer. So the Landfill Advisory Committee came out with a recommending none of the sites that had been evaluated and scored because of concerns about that. They asked us to go back and try to talk to military, find some land that would be military land, and or modifying Act 73 to sort of reduce the buffer distance to see if that would free up additional sites. So we did do that. And we got an extension of our deadline to name the new site, which was December 31st of 2022, and with a closure date of 2028. Those 2 dates are in our permit to operate the landfill from the Land Use Commission of the state. I got the 2-year extension. That was December of last year, so we needed to name a site. We did not have success in finding military land, and we did not have modifications to Act 73, so we needed to name one of those 6 sites, and that's what we did. So that's kind of how we got to that point. Mayor was very clear that we laid out a 3 Plan A, a Plan B, and Plan C, because he had made a commitment to the west side that we would not site the next landfill there. So the Plan A was to use the site that was identified. If that becomes not possible due to legislative action or making it not suitable legally, then we'd move to Plan B, which is to try and seek a modification to Act 73, which would free up some other sites. And then Plan C, if that is not successful, would be to do an expansion of the existing site, which is would be sort of the last ditch, possibility. We do have to have a landfill, as you folks know, in order to service our population. We have 1 million people we got on the island, and there is a lot of rubbish that needs to be taken care of.
Yeah, 1 million people and 10 million tourists to the state, so that's a lot of impact on our community.
Yeah.
Just to give people sort of a scope, how much trash are we producing, and where are you in that ABC? It looks more and more like A is kind of going away if the legislature is successful with making these restrictions. Are you going to Plan C, or do you think that Plan B is a viable option?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the first part was about how much waste there is. So basically 800,000 tons per year roughly is our waste stream that goes to H power. There is an additional part that doesn't go to H power, non-burnables, and then there's all construction and demolition waste. So the municipal solid waste stream is about 1 million tons a year. The construction demolition waste is another at least 500,000 tons a year, which currently goes to a commercial landfill, PVT landfill in Honolulu. And when that landfill closes, it has a fixed life. Also, that waste will also come to the city. So the landfill that we've planned for, that we've sized, includes both the C&D waste and the entire rest of the waste stream. Where we're at now is we would move then on to Plan B. And before we would, so it is a stepwise thing. So we would move to Plan B and try that.
When you talked about the legislative process right now, and there are, as you mentioned, 2 bills that would really help, will determine essentially what path you go down. What are the conversations like with those lawmakers? Have you been speaking, with those who are spearheading this or who are trying to advocate for this protection? And has the mayor also engaged in any of those conversations to see if there might be a compromise before things get to that legislative the end of the legislative process?
Yeah, so the legislative process is a long process, and so we've testified, at all the hearings, basically just providing comments, letting the legislators know the challenge, the challenge that this would cause for us, and other folks in those hearings have asked, either other legislators or other have asked, okay, so then where? What are you going to do? And that's not necessarily their job to find a site, but there aren't easy answers for that. So we're sort of following along in the process. There's we really can't prevent a law from being enacted, but it does look like that site is going to be eliminated in the legislative process.
2028 is very soon. So when you look at that timeline, let's say you are pursuing C, how much expansion can be done? And given that the mayor has said on this program and elsewhere that he does not want to burden that community because they've been hosting, all of that Opala for decades, how much longer would they have to be the site that now, receives all of that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We don't really know the answer to that. We haven't gotten too far on on sort of the due diligence of what's possible there with the expansion. We have some information, but it hasn't really been pursued. There is some possibility to do an expansion there, and there's also remaining capacity right now. So we're not really in a super urgent situation in terms of having a place to take our residuals. Right now we estimate that there's capacity within the permitted area, so permitted capacity essentially, which is different than permitted operation period, which is supposed to end in 2028. We would have to ask for an extension, but there is capacity till at least 2032. So we got a few more years there of at least we have someplace to put it if necessary before it ultimately have to have another location.
When we look at this issue as a whole, though, there obviously is a need for a space and a location. But when you just look at the amount of trash that, residents as well as visitors to the island are contributing to this, what other mitigation efforts or prevention efforts is the city taking on to maybe minimize the amount of trash that is, being produced by residents and visitors as a way to, try to reduce the impact that it will have on landfills moving forward?
Yeah, thank you for that. So our mantra is reduce, reuse, recycle, repeat. And so we have programs to try to reduce the waste stream, which is encouraging recycling, providing as many opportunities and making it as easy as possible for folks to recycle. and not do illegal dumping, for example, bulky items. We'll pick those up for free. We have our 7 convenience centers that are open 7 days a week, 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., located all over the island. There's also 3 transfer stations, which are also open those hours, and you can bring all the different things there. You can bring your waste there, you can bring your bulky items, you can bring your green waste and your recyclables, and it'll be recycled. And now we can also accept e-waste at all those facilities. And so now there's a new blue cart there, bin, which is expressly for e-waste, and that does all get recycled. So the more things we can recycle, the better. We continue to try to roll out additional recycling programs. One of them is food waste, as I know we talked about before. So we'll begin recycling food waste about a year from now. It's got a little bit delayed because of construction, and so the new facility is being constructed. It's a private facility, private contractor, but we awarded a contract, and it is under construction. And in that case, about 25% of what goes in the gray cart, which goes to H-Power, becomes ash, has to go to landfill, is food waste. It can be combined with the green waste and made into compost. Then you got a product that's recycled. It's a soil amendment. It's for sale. It's a good product that people can buy. That's a product we don't have to import, and it is recycling our materials. We also have an ash recycling project, which is in the permitting process now. We have it all designed, but we haven't started construction until we get our permits from the Department of Health, because the Department of Health has concerns, and they're going to tell us what the limits are and what we can use with it. But what we plan to do is to incorporate it into asphalt. And I want to emphasize that this is not just taking ash and throwing it in asphalt. It's a refining process to make a sand substitute. It'll substitute a small percentage in the asphalt. And this is done lots of places. It makes a lot of sense, and that could reduce the amount of ash that we send that has to go to landfill by 60%. So that's huge, really, and that's almost half the waste stream, going to landfill. So these are all things, and we have a lot of other things that we're trying to work on as well with respect to that.
How soon do you expect that ash program to be up and running?
So the ash program, we're still in the permitting process now, and once we get our permits in place and start construction, it's probably 2 to 3 years before it's actually working. But we're kind of used to these time frames. Everything, when you got to build something, takes quite a bit of time. So, yeah.
I want to ask you sort of a bigger question about the conversations that you've been having with community and what you feel. We had talked before in the past about how Red Hill really, that incident changed the conversation and people's concerns about putting these facilities over water, which is essentially the entire island, right? I mean, do we even know if the existing landfill is over an aquifer? I think that question is not fully answered, if I understand that correctly.
Right, so it's not over it's not within the no-pass zone.
Right.
So there's water everywhere, but some of it's protected by a protective layer called caprock. And so the existing landfill is in a caprock area.
So, but given that, and the challenges you have just from a public perception, what do you wish people understood about the safety of these facilities? We're going to be speaking with Councilmember Matt Weyer and also Wayne Tanaka from the Sierra Club, and we know that they have a different perspective. But when you're engaging in these and trying to make the argument that this is actually a safe technology, what are you telling folks?
Yeah, so there are lots of activities that we have to deal with waste and with other things, and it has to do with risk and potential for potential for contamination or something going wrong. And so as engineers, I'm an engineer. We have to provide mitigative measures, which are designed to prevent to the greatest extent possible. In this case, leakage. A good example would be an underground fuel storage tank. Red Hill is a colossal example, but every gas station has 5 or more underground storage tanks with your different grades of fuel in them, and those are double-walled tanks, and they have a leak detection system associated with them. And that's exactly what a landfill has too. It's very, very much identical, the way the regulations work, and there are federal rules associated with that. So the rules are put forward so that it's safe in the United States to put a landfill essentially anywhere if you follow all the rules of how it's designed, how it's monitored, how it's taken care of. And that's not just the landfill itself, but its surrounding area you have to monitor. When you close it, you have to seal it and then continue monitoring it for 30 years. And so there's a lot of protections put in place, and so we, of course, follow all those protections with our existing landfill and the closed landfills. And so we've found that they're safe and that they don't leak. And so what we have to do is follow the rules, and we, of course, do that.
You know, this may seem like a very naive question or basic question, but has you gone out into the community and talked about this project, and tried to sell different locations and areas and find different solutions to this? Has there been any community member that wants this? Has there been anybody that has said, yes, this is this is what we need, or you feel like you're just facing constant opposition because this is something that, as you mentioned, no one wants this in their backyard. But I'm just wondering if there has been any positive feedback from community members, rather than just opposition the whole time.
Yeah, not really. It's hard, and it's understandable. Folks don't necessarily want it near them. They have fears about, perhaps about contamination or odors or other things, perhaps traffic, dust, and things like that. And all those things are, of course, we're required to mitigate those. And we're lucky here. We're not really burying very much trash. We're mostly burying ash. So there isn't a lot of birds. There's nothing really attractive to the to pests. And so it's not quite the same as a typical landfill that you might see in a movie or on a video or on the mainland where we have mountains of rubbish. But yeah, no, it's hard. We don't really find any folks saying, yeah, do it here. The thing about the Central Oahu site is that it's in nobody's view plane. You can drive by it, of course, but nobody could see it from their house. It is kind of remote away from people, which is a good thing, but it's hard to find a place on the island. There's just not a lot of space.
Do you think that there is a better site out there? I mean, given all the work that you've done and all the due diligence that you've expressed, do you think that there's something that's missing? If you were able to get the reforms on 73, as you mentioned, do you think that there is a more suitable site?
Not really. Any site would have the same challenges. It's going to be in a community, and folks there are going to think make an argument that it's not fair that they hosted a landfill before, and there's definitely that's definitely an issue. This landfill's been at that location on the west side for 35 years. The previous 35 years it was in Kailua. The 35 years before that it was in Waianae, and that's 90, 100 years already. And then before that there were kind of landfills all over the place. None of them are lined. They're in Central Oahu. They're in Ala Moana. They're everywhere. They're all closed now. And so it is kind of about fairness and what's fair. Central Oahu hasn't had a landfill in a long time, and so maybe that's fair. But it is a challenge. It's a really big challenge. So we try to minimize how much is needed, make it as safe as possible, and we had hoped we had discussions with the military about the Waipio Peninsula. It's in Little Pearl Harbor. Is that a better place? I don't know. It's near Waipahu town. It is suitable. It meets all the requirements, but the military said for various reasons that they wouldn't allow it, or they came to that conclusion after talking with us for quite a while. So that could perhaps be resurrected. We don't know. We have to wrap up here, but just curious, how much of your time is, as a director of environmental services, is occupied by the landfill? Because I imagine there's still a litany of other things that you're also working on, but how much time are you spending on this issue? Yeah, not too much. Quite a bit today, Ryan, but other than that, no, there are a lot of other things to do, and it's just one of the things. So. Not too much, but it is something that's on the mind and something that council is interested in and the public, and we're happy to talk to people and hear and listen and try to, that's our job, is to figure out the best solution. Okay, well, I'm sure this is a continuing conversation that we will be having with you. Thank you for being here today. Happy to be here. Matt Weyer from the Honolulu City Council joined us right after the break. Stay with us. You're watching Spotlight Now.
Welcome back to Spotlight Now as we continue on in our conversation about what to do with Oahu's trash.
And we want to welcome in Councilmember Matt Weyer, who represents District 2, which is the district that would be most impacted if the city is successful in putting this landfill in central Oahu. It sounds from the conversation that we just had with Mr. Babcock that the city is not confident that they will be successful. What's your read on how likely this is to happen, given what we've seen in the legislature and the conversations in community?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely hopeful right from the beginning. We were concerned. I think many in the community were, given the impacts potentially on our water resources. I think that's why Board of Water Supply was opposed. In January, the City Council unanimously passed Resolution 25-03, which, again, opposed placing the landfill above our water resources. So I understand, environmental services, city administration's position, but, most folks at the city, I think, do see just the concern of protecting our water resources. And we're glad that our budget amendment was accepted to restrict the use of funds. And so that going forward in this upcoming fiscal year, we wouldn't be able to use city funds to purchase or acquire this particular parcel, right? And I do think these bills have a really good shot. And I think what the bills that the legislature show is just that we need to be mindful of protecting our natural resources, right? I think, what I appreciate about the administration, about Mayor, Director Babcock, who's brilliant, right? He's doing so much great work. They're following the law as the best they can, and they're looking at what the Land Use Commission has ordered. They're looking at the options on the table, and the cards that they've been dealt, are pretty challenging. But when we're looking at just what we've experienced with Red Hill, Central Oahu, right, with PFAS and heptachlor, so much history there, understanding the priority that we have, and just the experience we had, right? We're the generation that saw what happened with Red Hill. It's not completely the same, right? But when we're looking at protecting our water, I think that it really has risen to the top in people's minds. And I think that's why everybody's passions have, gotten risen up and they've been engaged. And of course, we don't want to, freak anybody out because nothing like this is going to happen overnight. Like, it's going to take years to build an actual landfill. And so just glad we're able to have this conversation together and really figure out where is the best place to put it.
There was a large community response when this announcement was made, and obviously there was many in your community who I'm sure voiced their opinions and concerns with you in your office directly. What were some of those concerns that you heard, and was the community given any sort of heads up that this might be a site? I mean, because it seemed by the response that we got that many people were just kind of caught off guard. What was the reaction, I guess, that you've heard from your community members and some of their concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone was surprised, from community to the landowner. And so I think in terms of, just the response, I think that's why we saw that initial reaction from a lot of people. I think as we've digested, what the legislature is doing, what options are in the table, people are getting a better grasp, right? I do think this process, right, it's been a multi-year process. It's been methodical. And so with that in mind, like, it has been intensive, and I think it's going in the right direction. I'm not going to criticize how it was rolled out. It happened. So if it's just talking about how I would roll it out, I think it is important we do that community engagement, right? Lay out what options are on the table, give folks the benefit of the doubt. I do think it is hard, to get a whole argument into a 20 to 30 second news clip, right? But being able to lay out, these are the options, let's talk through it, let's look at what's on the table. We've talked about putting it above the aquifer, also on prime agricultural land, which is currently being utilized, right? And so when we contemplate our sustainability goals for 2050, the state goals, we have to be mindful of that. The other option, looking on maybe on the windward side of particular sites, and of course, the direction that many of us don't want to go is putting it in perpetuity on the west side, so that's kind of what's on the table. I think it's important for us to talk through that.
Yeah, and when, the argument that he was making toward the end there, talking about equity, right?
Yeah.
That certain communities, we know that the community that's hosting us now that landfill has overstayed its welcome, and no landfill obviously is welcome.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you sort of respond to that argument that, well, Central Oahu hasn't had one, and so it's their turn?
Yeah, I would never want to pit a community against another community. I think folks in Central Oahu recognize that, folks that do have those 3 bins that get picked up, 1/3 of those bins come to Central Oahu, right down the street from where this landfill would be. Of course, that's composting. And that's what we want to do more of. And that's what's appropriate on agricultural land. And so when we're looking at equity, I think particularly with Waimanalo Gulch, right, we're recognizing the impact of the west side and wanting to ensure that that community is treated fairly. We know that with PVT closing, right, that construction and demolition waste is going to be coming out of Nanakuli and will have to at some point come into the city landfill. And I think it's something we have to have, it's a conversation we have to have as a community, right? We want to ensure that no one community is bearing the full burden of our waste. And we've had conversations about decentralized waste management. Of course, we have to be mindful, where's that no pass zone, right? We know the Board of Water Supply has objected. We know they're wanting to protect our drinking water. And so that does take a lot of land off the table. It takes a lot of military land off the table if we're talking about Schofield, right? But as we're looking through all the different options, I think there's a lot of great ideas that have come from the community. Looking at military lands, looking at communities or spaces where they haven't had landfills. I mean, I think those are all reasonable things to discuss. But I do think, equity-wise, I don't think it would be necessarily the equitable solution to say, oh, we're going to move it a little further east from, Nanakuli to Waipahu, for example, or up to central Oahu, where right up the street from Whitmore Village, actually, and then just down the street where we're already dealing with a lot of the city's waste.
When we're looking at the legislative process and the two bills that are kind of moving through that could determine all of this, what have been the conversation or the city council's engagement with the legislature on this to help craft this? Because this ultimately is a decision that is being made by lawmakers at the Capitol and then the state level, but it is a city issue. And so how is that engagement going with lawmakers across the street from you folks at Honolulu Hale? And what insights or input do you maybe provide to them about management moving forward on this city issue?
Yeah, no, I can say I've been so grateful and appreciative of our legislators, our area legislators, and just other colleagues at the Capitol. And so we have been having those conversations since December, right, when we got this announcement, December last year. And I think going forward, I mean, it just speaks to how we need to be continuing in collaboration, not just on landfill placement, right? We're talking about cesspool conversion and the mandates coming down from state law. The fact that the city obviously is increasing its sewer capacity, but we need to be working together on all of these issues from, county, state to the federal level. And I think that really is the solution going forward.
When you look at the he laid out ABC, right?
Yeah,
that there are three options. It sounds like more and more A is off the table, that this site that they've chosen is probably going to be legislated out of reach. The idea that we would expand capacity and hopefully limit the waste that we're putting in there with some of the recycling programs, the composting that he talked about, turning ash into brick or ash into asphalt. All of that sounds good, but ultimately for you, what do you think is the best option for this?
I mean, last week I was talking to Dr. Babcock at an event about, the day we can get to where we don't need a landfill, right? And that would be perfect. And he thinks that there's pathways to get there. In the short term, we do need a location, as we're making this transition, like I mentioned he mentioned when C&D waste, that construction and demolition waste comes over to the city, you need a place to put that. You need a place to put the ash. And so I do think, at this point, and I can't speak for the administration, but if you're looking at that 2028 deadline, realistically, in the space that we are right now, there will probably have to be an extension until we can get a new location sited. But as we're going through this process, and like you said, recycling ash, composting more, we're pushing back the date a little bit, but next year the food waste will get to come in. At some point, manufactured compostables will come in from the law we passed a couple years ago. The more we can compost, recycle, reduce, reuse, I mean, it really is, kako thing, right? Everyone on this island needs to be mindful of what we're producing. And I think that I'm hopeful because I think our youth get it. When I'm at our schools, they understand that what we're facing as a community. I mean, District 2 in particular, you drive that highway in Kolapoko, Kolaloa, see it crumbling into the ocean, homes on North Shore falling into the ocean. I don't think anyone doubts that the future ahead of us has a lot of challenges. And so we have to be able to multitask, whether it's on the landfill, cesspools, public safety, housing, and I think, like Dr. Babcock said, it's a tough job. And so I don't envy his job, But the more we can work together on it, I do think there are a lot of solutions out there.
Yeah. Do you think that the city at its current position is doing enough for expansion of these other alternatives in recycling efforts? What else can be done from your perspective that that can really engage the community more and having to worry less about what to do with trash overall?
Yeah, we're on pace. And I think like so many of these issues, again, I'm kind of new to this 2.5 years in. I think many of the problems we see, we get frustrated and we wonder, are we actually making a dent? Because sometimes they seem to be growing faster than the solutions we're providing. But we are making improvements, right? Like we mentioned, with food waste being able to go into that green bin and into our composting at some point, anything that's compostable that's manufactured, I would like to see that going into our composting facility, the recycling that's on track to reduce what needs to go into a landfill. We have our plastic bottle bill. It's so minor, right? Some youth had asked us to get plastic bottles out of vending machines. A no-brainer. Something that doesn't impact businesses, but allows the city to lead by example and allows us to contemplate everything we throw into the rubbish can is going to create a need for a landfill. And so we're not, at the end point yet. And I think we need to keep diving into these deeper and pushing ourselves to see how far we can go in terms of better managing our waste. Don't put plastic into your green bin right now. I know I have a problem with that. Right? People put all their yard clippings into the trash bag and then dump it into the green bin, and that creates plastic contamination. And we need education, and I think we'll get there because I think our community is pretty bright, pretty smart. And so as long as they have the information, I think we can get to these solutions.
We've been sort of saying that as kind of a given that this is going to pass the legislature, but there's always a chance that it doesn't. We don't necessarily know. There's still about a month left. Well, a little bit less, 3 weeks.
Yeah, it's flown by.
So, it's crunch time for them over there. And if that is not successful and these bills don't make it through for whatever reason, are there other avenues that the community has to oppose this site in particular? Are you confident that this site, that it won't be built there?
I would never say. I would say at times there's people in the community that are more confident than I am. I want to make sure everyone knows we need to keep paying attention, testifying. Well, at this point now, it's following, reaching out to legislators for the legislation at the Capitol, for the city, tracking the budget amendments that got accepted, submitting testimony on that for this upcoming year, and continuing to ensure that you're having those conversations with the broader community as well, right? All of us have friends and family across the island. And so ensuring that folks realize that this isn't a community-specific issue. We know no one wants a landfill in their backyard, but when we're talking about protecting our drinking water and just the impact that would have on the entire community, I think people understand that. And so we have to have those conversations so people can hear and know what's going on.
I know we are focused on the landfill, but we do have a few more minutes, and I just want to get your perspective and take of where things are at with the budgeting process over there at the city council. This is a very difficult time as the council and leadership, as well as the administration, is trying to balance out the needs of the community while also factoring in things that are happening on a national level and potential cuts that are coming from Washington D.C. How has that budgeting process been going overall, and are you confident that the city's in a good shape moving forward?
Yeah, I think really at this time, the most important thing the city can do is provide just stability for our community. And in terms of budget, I think we're striving to ensure that we're going to be there till the very end to meet the needs of our community. Last year, we put in those extra positions to work with marginalized communities, particularly immigrant communities. We beefed up our anti-discrimination laws to put us in a good space. And then, of course, as we go forward, there's safeguards to take care of the federal funding we could be losing to cover city positions and city services. As so many have, I have been encouraging our community to reach out and keep us in the loop about what they're experiencing. We've seen job loss, right, both at the federal level and, of course, the nonprofits that work with them, the programs that have lost. And my heart breaks, of course, for our community. But really, it's just important for the community to know that we're here. We're not going anywhere. We're going to be standing with them, and we're going to be standing for them through all of this.
Yeah, one last question on the landfill before we let you go. Roger Babcock did lay out, and he has in other forums as well, their argument for why this is safe, that they're going above and beyond the requirements, that this is 800 feet above. This is not nearly as close as the Red Hill fuel tanks, and obviously those were constructed at a different time with different standards. are you not confident in the technology? Like, is that the issue here? Do you think that this is absolutely not safe, or is it something else?
No, I believe in data, I believe in science, I believe in engineering, and I think Dr. Babcock is a wonderful engineer. I think when you're looking at the risk, I don't think it's accurate to say there's no risk. Even the federal government has acknowledged all landfills leak at some point, right? And that's why our chief engineer at the Board of Water Supply has opposed this location. Both engineers with a lot of experience, and of course, when you're tasked with engineering a landfill, you're going to engineer it in the best way possible to protect our community. But when we're looking at just the need to think into the future and ensure that what we experienced, right, this generation experience, that experience is going to fade from memory, right? And so as we take what we learned from Red Hill, now is an opportunity for us to implement that, to protect, not just our children, but really this is our children's children and future generations.
Okay, I think that's a great place to leave it. Matt Weyer, thank you so much for being here. Council member representing District 2. On the other side of the break, Wayne Tanaka from the Sierra Club join us. Stay with us. You're watching Spotlight Now.
From the moment you wake up.
Hawaii News Now brings you the stories that impact your day.
With more on the breaking news, we go live to Casey Lund.
Ready with the push alert? I'm going live. We have an update to the breaking news we brought you this morning on Sunrise.
Okay, guys, as soon as this wraps, toss to Mahia.
And we've been covering this story all day.
Now we go live to Mahia for a new development.
Stand by for breaking news. They just captured the suspect.
That's confirmed?
Yes, sources just confirmed it.
The news you need the moment it breaks.
Here on Hawaii News Now.
First alert traffic is like always having a helpful passenger right next to you.
There's a crash up ahead in the left lane.
When we see a backup, we'll tell you live on TV.
That doesn't look too good.
And send an alert to your phone.
I'll type, you drive.
First alert traffic on TV, streaming, and on the Hawaii News Now app.
Keeping you and your ohana safe.
Spotlight Now with Yunji Denise and Ryan Kalei-Suchi. Connecting you with newsmakers from throughout our islands. Going in depth with Hawaii's leaders. And taking your questions live. Spotlight Now, where Hawaii comes to talk.
Well, thanks for sticking around with us here on Spotlight Now as we continue on our conversation about the proposed site for Oahu's next landfill and some of the proponents and opposition that comes with this recommendation of this site that the mayor's administration has put forth.
We've heard a lot of interesting perspectives, and we want to bring in one more, and that is Wayne Tanaka, who's the director of the Sierra Club here in Hawaii. Wayne, based on what you just heard, we know that your organization has been pretty vocal in its opposition. I'd like to start where we left off with the council member, and that is this idea that, the question of whether you think that this technology is safe at the end of the day. Do you believe in the engineering and the science that he was laying out, or do you think that these are just not safe facilities?
Just as Councilmember Weyer said, landfills will inevitably leak, right? And even setting that aside, setting aside the ever-present risk of human error, of sabotage, of earthquakes, thinking about what we're going to be dealing with in the decades ahead, right? By 2050, hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 billion people are going to be displaced from climate change. We're already seeing the chronic inundation of coastal cities, Florida, New Jersey. We're going to be experiencing droughts that are going to cause mass hunger, starvation, regional conflicts, and all this will boil down to breakdowns in supply chains. So you're going to it takes a lot of resources to operate and maintain a facility safely like this, and so we can't rely on being able to bring in the kinds of resources we need to maintain the integrity of this facility. On top of that, just locally, we know we're going to experience way more extreme, way more frequent natural weather phenomena, right? So floods, hurricanes, fires driven by high winds, and again, that's going to present unprecedented challenges to maintaining the integrity of this landfill.
Is there one primary environmental concern that worries you the most about this landfill on this proposed site? Just knowing your work and the work that your organization does, is there some environmental concerns that maybe people aren't aware of or stick out to you as most significant?
Again, I think as Councilmember Weyer mentioned, right, this isn't just our water. This is our children's water. This is our grandkids' water. And again, thinking about the big picture of what's going on with our planet, we're already 90% of our islands are already experiencing more water scarcity and less rainfall than 100 years ago. We have models that show significant reductions in rainfall, particularly in the leeward areas, but also too potentially in the wetter areas. I think one model looks at a 30% reduction in windward regions and a 60% reduction of rainfall in the leeward regions. So our grandkids are going to need as much water as they can get. And so really, my concern is, are we robbing our grandkids of this precious resource that's going to be vital to their survival?
I'm curious to know, if not there, then where? And I know that's not your responsibility, right? The city and county has to figure that out. But when you look at the possibilities that Roger Babcock laid out, A, B, and C, A being where it is now or where it's proposed now, B being changing Act 73 and perhaps opening up some new areas, or C, expanding the existing site for more capacity. What appeals to you in those three scenarios?
First off, I would definitely not see. I mean, I think that's kind of informing the challenges that we're seeing, right? The folks in West Oahu and Honolulu, they've had to bear the burden of hosting our trash, for decades, and all of the health impacts, socioeconomic impacts that comes with that. And it's not just, these landfills. It's there's a H power plant that's located in the area. It's a food desert out there. There's just thinking about, folks have to sit in traffic for 2-3 hours a day just to go to work, just to try and make ends meet. And so where's the justice, right? And I think when people observe that and see how we just disregard, all of the impacts and all of the burdens we're laying on this community, they're not going to trust the city or the government to do right by them if there's a conversation about pulling landfill in their area, right? So I think that's a missing component in the discussion of maybe we need to start addressing, finally the need for justice, for compensation, reparations, and not just monetary. And I don't want to go out and say what that looks like. I think it should be members of that community to help kind of figure out what's the best way to address the burdens that they've borne. And I'll just throw this out there as well. What if we look to them for advice or even playing a decision-making role in the planning of this facility? Not just in the siting, but identifying all of the myriad ways that it can impact the surrounding areas, surrounding communities, and then we can start talking about how we can address those things, right? And of course, I do want to add, I don't want to suggest that we just go ahead and ask people to contribute their mana'o and their insight for free either, right? That kind of information is so much more valuable than any consultant. So and that's a bigger conversation I think we need to have about how we get information from the community and how we value that.
So if just going back to the initial question of if it is not option C, do you support any area or a possible solution to this issue based on what we know and the timeline that's ahead of us? Is there an area that the Sierra Club would maybe consider as a possible alternative?
Yeah, I think there still needs to be more work and more discussion, obviously, as I think Councilmember Weyer pointed out. I do want to highlight that I have a lot of questions about the Navy's reluctance to allow their lands to be considered for the sending, especially what we've seen. I mean, we're in a water crisis now because of years of neglect and malfeasance with Red Hill, and why would they not consider allowing us opportunities, options that will prevent the further contamination of our island's drinking water? And so, I really hope the mayor understands that he doesn't have to take no for an answer. The Navy said no to us before. They've said they're never going to shut down Red Hill, and now we've got 100-something million gallons of fuel out of those tanks.
On the subject of Red Hill, I know this is kind of a little bit of a diversion, but I do want to ask you about, there have been talks now to reactivate that site and to repurpose it, and I'm just curious to get your reaction to what you've been hearing and what your concerns might be.
What I've heard, and I'm not sure if this is put out in any official decision-making document, but their preferred alternative is to close in place without fill, which means they'll just keep these tanks open and empty indefinitely. And there are definitely some concerns with that. Like these empty tanks, they're already almost a century old. They've been rusting, throughout that time. So is there a risk of collapse? Is that going to, harm the neighboring communities? I know folks like where Red Hill is like their backyard, literally their backyard. Beyond that, my understanding is they're going to try and coat the inside of these tanks with some kind of protective material to prevent further degradation. But what happens to that coating, over time, right? 20, 30, 50 years from now, because this facility is still 100 feet above our source aquifer. So will that, lead to further contamination? So there are, I think, a lot of unanswered questions and concerns about at least what I've been hearing as a preferred alternative.
When it comes to issues like this, of course, we know what happened with Red Hill, and the engagement of the community really came to play and was on full display when everything happened a few years ago. As you are now navigating these types of further discussions with the city about what to do with this landfill, how has your the reception been by the administration, by these lawmakers of your concerns? Do you feel that your voice is being heard by our lawmakers? Are they taking into account some of the things that you are bringing up? And do you think that Red Hill made a difference in the relationships that you may now have with some of these elected officials?
Yeah, absolutely. I think people are very conscious of the conundrum we're in, just from Red Hill alone, and how important it is to remember how precious our water is. It's our most precious resource, and that's not, that's a thing, right? My concern is that over time, we'll start forgetting again, because we forgot with Red Hill, right? We let this ticking time bomb sit for decades and for years after a major spill, and really didn't do much of anything to prevent what has happened, right? Just deferring to the Navy and their assurances that they'll keep everything safe, which in hindsight obviously was and even, a lot of folks back then questioned that. I think there's always a risk that we may begin to forget again. But I'm hopeful that we will carry these lessons forward, especially with the young folks. With all of the students that I've been talking to, like they're hyper aware of that. This is their future. Their water is their future, and hopefully they can continue on. Hopefully people stay engaged, and really that's that's what we need to do now more than ever is to participate in governance, so that we have a truly representative democracy and not just folks making decisions for us.
I'm interested, sort of what we were talking about with the councilman too, in terms of, the legislative process is not over, so there is always a possibility that this does not pass and that this site is still a viable option for the city. If that is the case, what is the Sierra Club planning to do to try to oppose this from actually coming to fruition?
So there's a lot of things that have to happen, right, for this to actually take place. I mean, they have to acquire the land, they have to go through the permitting process, environment review, they have to go to the land use commission. So there are a lot of opportunities, I think, for people to raise their concerns. And we will, should these bills not pass, I think, we'll continue to educate the community on how they can get engaged in these processes and opportunities to take action and so forth.
Beyond this specific site, what else do you think that the city and county of Honolulu needs to do to address waste management and to kind of steer away from our reliance on these landfills and the need for them?
Not too long ago, our island supported upwards of 1 million people with no plastic, right? Without things that we would need to landfill, really. So much of our waste stream, when you think about it, it exists because we're now so incredibly reliant on imports, right? Our food, other goods, all that comes with packaging, all this stuff, ends up in our landfill. And so we really need to think about how we can restore these systems of self-sufficiency There are studies that show that if we do pivot towards traditional agricultural models and crops, and looking at, even looking at land use changes like urbanization and climate change, we can still feed 1 million people or more just with what we have here. So looking at policies that can uplift those kinds of things, right? So and there's no one solution, right? Like we all look at how our ag lands are being used, like these luxury developments that are sucking up all the water and growing swimming pools and covered garages. We need to look at how we can promote native Hawaiian agricultural practices, which may hold the key. Pretty much is our best and last chance at creating the self-sufficient society we need to deal with the climate realities that we are going to face.
I want to sort of piggyback on what Ryan was saying about the voice of the Sierra Club and organizations like it, the Community Voice. I mean, the mayor announced this, the city announced this, the community reaction was swift, and it seems like there has been a reaction. I mean, what does that tell you about, the willingness of officials to actually listen to community? Because you don't always see that.
Right. I'm actually legitimately grateful that the mayor, a couple of things that he made it clear we're not going to continue burdening West Oahu with our trash. And second, he's created an opportunity for people to once again come together and remind each other that we all have this collective kuleana, right, to our home, to our vai, and to our future generations. And so we've seen, just like with Red Hill, we've seen youth show up, we've seen kupuna, retirees show up, we've working class folks, white collar folks, all coming together to protect our water. And that's not something that you'll find in many other places, and so it's a I think there's hope there, for sure.
Wayne Tanaka of the Sierra Club, thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate your time. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this.
From the moment you wake up,
Hawaii News Now brings you the stories that impact your day.
With more on the breaking news, we go live to Casey Lund.
Ready with the push alert? I'm going live.
We have an update to the breaking news we brought you this morning on Sunrise.
Okay, guys, as soon as this wraps, toss to Mahia.
And we've been covering this story all day.
Now we go live to Mahia for a new development.
Stand by for breaking news. They just captured the suspect.
That's confirmed?
Yes, sources just confirmed it.
The news you need the moment it breaks.
Here on Hawaii News Now.
Spotlight Now with Yunji Denise and Right Kalei Suchi. Connecting you with newsmakers from throughout our islands. Going in depth with Hawaii's leaders. And taking your questions live. Spotlight Now, where Hawaii comes to talk.
We're going to engage a conversation today on the future of Oahu's landfill. We started off the conversation, of course, speaking to Dr. Babcock about the city's proposal. And you heard from him of the many things that the city and county is trying to do to help reduce waste that is going into these landfills. But when it ultimately comes to this site in central Oahu, there seems to be some hesitation if this is actually going to go through with the legislative process.
Yeah, you really heard from him kind of I wouldn't say resignation, but an acknowledgement that the legislative process is moving forward. It looks like 2 bills will pass, are likely to pass, and those would make that Wahiawa site off the table. Where do they go from there? They laid out 3 options, A being what they have now, B being changing legislation that would then open up new parts of the island, or C, expanding the existing landfill to have more capacity, at least for a few more years. All of those options come with downsides, and so it really feels like a no-win situation.
We also heard from Councilmember Matt Weyer, who expressed the concerns of his community that would be impacted by this, and acknowledging that he believes in the science that the mayor and the administration has been touting about how safe this would be for this community, but also saying that there are things that happen and there are unforeseen circumstances, whether it be weather related, that could ultimately impact the aquifer, which is the leading argument by many who oppose this landfill in this area because of course, what has happened with Red Hill as well.
Yeah, you heard Wayne Tanaka echoing that as well, just talking about how important our water resources are, especially in light of what's happened since Red Hill and the reluctance of any community over an aquifer to host this site. Also, it was interesting to hear his argument about how this is really a social justice issue, and that we've seen the West Side bear the burden for as long as it has, and that there is a fairness and an equity argument to be made that they should should no longer be the folks who have to house this. So a lot more to come on this, certainly not resolved. Very encouraging, though, also to hear about the city's food composting program that should be happening in about a year, and also about learning, e-waste and turning ash into asphalt. So a lot of
fascinating
good
stuff.
stuff that is happening. Next week, Honolulu Mayor Rick Blangiardi will join us. We'll be talking to him about this and the impacts of the Trump administration's federal policy, how that could impact the city's budget.
Yeah, looking forward to that conversation. Again, we want to encourage you to engage in our conversation with our guests. You can head over to Facebook during our show and type in your questions and continue to be involved in our conversation here on Spotlight Now. We'll see you next week, Tuesday.
Aloha.